Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're reading again from A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, starting with chapter 26, The First Newspaper. When I told the king I was going out disguised as a petty freeman to scour the country and familiarize myself with the humbler life of the people, he was all afire with the novelty of the thing in a minute, and was bound to take a chance in the adventure himself. Nothing should stop him. He would drop everything and go along. It was the prettiest idea he had run across for many a day. He wanted to glide out the back way and start at once, but I showed him that wouldn't answer. You see, he was billed for the king's evil, to touch for it, I mean, and it wouldn't be right to disappoint the house, and it wouldn't make a delay worth considering anyway. It was only a one-night stand, and I thought he ought to tell the queen he was going away. He clouded up at that and looked sad. I was sorry I had spoken, especially when he said mournfully, "Thou forgettest that Launcelot is here, and where Launcelot is, she noteth not the going forth of the king, nor what day he returneth." Of course I changed the subject. Yes, Guinevere was beautiful, it is true, but take her all around, she was pretty slack. I never meddled in these matters. They weren't my affair, but I did hate to see the way things were going on, and I don't mind saying that much. Many's the time she had asked me, "Sir Boss, hast seen Sir Launcelot about?" But if ever she went fretting around for the king, I didn't happen to be around at the time. There was a very good layout for the king's evil business, very tidy and creditable. The king sat under a canopy of state. About him were clustered a large body of the clergy in full canonicals. Conspicuous, both for location and personal outfit, stood Marinell, a hermit of the quack doctor species, to introduce the sick. All abroad over the spacious floor and clear down to the doors in a thick jumble lay or sat the scrofulous under a strong light. It was as good as a tableau. In fact, it had all the look of being gotten up for that, though it wasn't. There were 800 sick people present. The work was slow. It lacked the interest of novelty for me because I had seen the ceremonies before. The thing soon became tedious, but the properties required me to stick it out. The doctor was there for the reason that in all such crowds there were many people who only imagined something was the matter with them, and many who were consciously sound but wanted the immortal honor of fleshly contact with the king, and yet others who pretended to illness in order to get the piece of coin that went with the touch. Up to this time, this coin had been a wee little gold piece worth about a third of a dollar. When you consider how much that amount of money would buy in that age and country, and how usual it was to be scrofulous when not dead, you would understand that the annual King's Evil appropriation was just the river and harbor bill of that government for the grip it took on the treasury and the chance it afforded for skinning the surplus. So I had privately concluded to touch the treasury itself for the King's Evil. I covered 6/7 of the appropriation into the treasury a week before starting from Camelot on my adventures, and ordered that the other seventh be inflated into 5-cent nickels and delivered into the hands of the head clerk of the King's Evil department. A nickel to take the place of each gold coin, you see, and do its work for me. It might strain the nickel some, but I judged it could stand it. As a rule, I do not approve of watering stock, but I considered it square enough in this case, for it was just a gift anyway. Of course, you can water a gift as much as you want to, and I generally do. The old gold and silver coins of the country were of ancient and unknown origin as a rule, but some of them were Roman. They were ill-shapen and seldom rounder than a moon that is a week past the full. They were hammered, not minted, and they were so worn with use that the devices upon them were illegible as blisters and looked like them. I judged that a sharp, bright new nickel with a first-rate likeness of the king on one side of it and Guinevere on the other and a blooming pious motto would take the tuck out of scrofula as handy as a nobler coin and please the scrofulous fancy more, and I was right. This batch was the first it was tried on, and it worked to a charm. The saving and expense was a notable economy. You will see that by these figures. We touched a trifle over 700 of the 800 patients. At former rates, this would have cost the government about $240. At the new rate, we pulled through for about $35, thus saving upward of $200 at one swoop. To appreciate the full magnitude of this stroke, consider these other figures. The annual expenses of a national government amount to the equivalent of a contribution of 3 days' average wages of every individual of the population, counting every individual as if he were a man. If you take a nation of 60 millions, where average wages are $2 per day, 3 days' wages taken from each individual will provide $360 million and pay the government's expenses. In my day, in my own country, this money was collected from imposts, and the citizen imagined that the foreign importer paid it, and it made him comfortable to think so, whereas in fact it was paid by the American people and was so equally and exactly distributed among them that the annual cost to the 100 millionaire and the annual cost to the suckling child of the day laborer was precisely the same. Each paid $6. Nothing could be equaler than that, I reckon. Well, Scotland and Ireland were tributary to Arthur, and the united populations of the British Islands amounted to something less than 1 million. A mechanic's average wage was 3 cents a day when he paid his own keep. By this rule, the nation's government's expenses were $90,000 a year, or about $250 a day. Thus, by the substitution of nickels for gold on a king's evil day, I not only injured no one, dissatisfied no one, but pleased all concerned and saved 4/5 of that day's national expense into the bargain, a saving which would have been the equivalent of $800,000 in my day in America. In making this substitution, I had drawn upon the wisdom of a very remote source, the wisdom of my boyhood, for the true statesman does not despise any wisdom, howsoever lowly may be its origin. In my boyhood, I had always saved my pennies and contributed buttons to the foreign missionary cause. Buttons would answer the ignorant savage as well as coin. The coin would answer me better than buttons. All hands were happy and nobody hurt. Marinell took the patients as they came. He examined the candidate. If he couldn't qualify, he was warned off. If he could, he was passed along to the king. A priest pronounced the words, "They shall lay their hands on the sick and they shall recover." Then the king stroked the ulcers while the reading continued. Finally, the patient graduated and got his nickel, the king hanging it around his neck himself, and was dismissed. Would you think that that would cure? It certainly did. Any mummery will cure if a patient's faith is strong in it. Up by Astolat there was a chapel where the Virgin had once appeared to a girl who used to herd geese around there. The girl said so herself. And they built the chapel upon that spot and hung a picture in it representing the occurrence, a picture which you would think it dangerous for a sick person to approach, whereas on the contrary, thousands of the lame and the sick came and prayed before it every year and went away whole and sound, and even the well could look upon it and live. Of course, when I was told these things, I did not believe them, but when I went there and saw them, I had to succumb. I saw the cures affected myself, and they were real cures and not questionable. I saw cripples whom I had seen around Camelot for years on crutches arrive and pray before that picture and put down their crutches and walk off without a limp. There were piles of crutches there which had been left by such people as a testimony. In other places, people operated on a patient's mind without saying a word to him and cured him. In others, experts assembled patients in a room and prayed over them and appealed to their faith, and those patients went away cured. Wherever you find a king who can't cure the king's evil, you can be sure that the most valuable superstition that supports his throne, the subject's belief in the divine appointment of his sovereign, has passed away. In my youth, the monarchs of England had ceased to touch for the evil, but there was no occasion for this diffidence. They could have cured it 49 times in 50. Well, when the priest had been droning for 3 hours and the good king polishing the evidences and the sick were still pressing forward as plenty as ever, I got to feeling intolerably bored. I was sitting by an open window not far from the canopy of state. For the 500th time, a patient stood forward to have his repulsivenesses stroked. Again those words were being droned out, "They shall lay their hands on the sick," when outside there rang clear as a clarion a note that enchanted my soul and tumbled 13 worthless centuries about my ears. Camelot Weekly Hosanna and Literary Volcano. Latest eruption, only 2 cents, all about the big miracle of the Valley of Holiness. One greater than kings had arrived, the newsboy. But I was the only person in all that throng who knew the meaning of this mighty birth and what this imperial magician was come into the world to do. I dropped a nickel out of the window and got my paper. The Atom newsboy of the world went around the corner to get my change. It is around the corner yet. It was delicious to see a newspaper again, yet I was conscious of a secret shock when my eye fell upon the first batch of display headlines. I had lived in a clammy atmosphere of reverence, respect, deference so long that they sent a quivery little cold wave through me. High times in the Valley of Holiness. The water morks corked. Here Merlin works his arts, but gets left. But the boss scores on his first innings. the miraculous well uncorked amid awful outbursts of infernal fire and smoke and thunder. The buzzard roost astonished, unparalleled rejoinings, and so on, and so on. Yes, it was too loud. Once I could have enjoyed it and seen nothing out of the way about it, but now its note was discordant. It was good Arkansas journalism, but this was not Arkansas. Moreover, the next to the last line was calculated to give offense to the hermits, and perhaps lose us their advertising. Indeed, there was too lightsome a tone of flippancy all through the paper. It was plain I had undergone a considerable change without noticing it. I found myself unpleasantly affected by pert little irreverencies which would have seemed but proper and airy graces of speech at an earlier period of my life. There was an abundance of the following breed of items, and they discomforted me. Local smoke and cinders. Sir Lancelot met up with old King a grievance of Ireland unexpectedly last week over the moor south of Sir Balmoral de Merveilleus's hog pasture. The widow has been notified. Expedition number 3 will start about the 1st of next month on a search for Sir Sagramore le Desirous. It is in command of the renowned Knight of the Red Lawns, assisted by Sir Persant of Indy, who is is competent, intelligent, courteous, and in every way a brick, and further assisted by Sir Palamedes, the Saracen, who is no huckleberry himself. This is no picnic. These boys mean business. The readers of the Hosanna will regret to learn that the handsome and popular Sir Charolais of Gaul, who during his 4-week stay at the Bull and Halibut this city has won every heart by his polished manners and elegant conversation, will pull out today for home. Give us another call, Charlie. The business end of the funeral of the late Sir Dalliance, the Duke's son of Cornwall, killed in an encounter with the giant of the knotted bludgeon last Tuesday on the borders of the Plain of Enchantment, was in the hands of the ever affable and efficient Mumble, Prince of Undertakers, than whom there exists none by whom it were a more satisfying pleasure to have the last sad offices performed. Give him a trial. The comial thanks of the Hosanna office are due, from editor down to devil, to the ever-courteous and thoughtful Lord High Steward of the Palace's third assistant, for several saucets of ice cream, a quality calculated to make the eye of the recipients humid with gratitude, and it done it. When this administration wants to chalk up a desirable name for early promotion, the Hosanna would like a chance to suggest. The Demoiselle Irene Dulap of South Astolat is visiting her uncle, the popular host of the Cattleman's Boarding House, Liver Lane, this city. Young Barker, the bellows mender, is home again and looks much improved by his vacation roundup among the outlying smithies. See his ad. Of course, it was good enough journalism for a beginning. I knew that quite well, and yet it was somehow disappointing. The court circular pleased me better. Indeed, its simple and dignified respectfulness was a distinct refreshment to me after all those disgraceful familiarities. But even it could have been improved. Do what one may, there is no getting an air of variety into a court circular. I acknowledge that. There is a profound monotonousness about its facts that baffles and defeats one's sincerest efforts to make them sparkle and enthuse. The best way to manage, in fact the only sensible way, is to disguise repetitiousness of fact under variety of form. Skin your fact each time and lay on a new cuticle of words. It deceives the eye. You think it is a new fact. It gives you the idea that the court is carrying on like everything. This excites you, and you drain the whole column with a good appetite, and perhaps never notice that it's a barrel of soup made out of a single bean. Clarence's way was good, it was simple, it was dignified, it was direct and businesslike. All I say, it was not the best way. Court circular. On Monday, the king rode in the park. On Tuesday, the king rode in the park. On Wednesday, the king rode in the park, and so on through Sunday. However, take the paper by and large, I was vastly pleased with it. Little crudities of a mechanical sort were observable here and there, but there were not enough of them to amount to anything, and it was good enough Arkansas proofreading anyhow, and better than was needed in Arthur's day and realm. As a rule, the grammar was leaky and the construction more or less lame, but I did not much mind these things. They are common defects of my own, and one mustn't criticize other people on grounds where he can't stand perpendicular himself. I was hungry enough for literature to want to take down the whole paper at this one meal, but I got only a few bites and then had to postpone because the monks around me besieged me so with eager questions. What is this curious thing? What is it for? Is it a handkerchief, saddle blanket, part of a shirt? What is it made of? How thin it is, and how dainty and frail, and how it rattles. Will it wear, you think, and won't the rain injure it? Is it writing that appears on it, or is it only ornamentation? They suspected it was writing because those among them who knew how to read Latin and had a smattering of Greek recognized some of the letters, but they could make nothing out of the results as a whole. I put my information in the simplest form I could. It is a public journal. I will explain what that is another time. It is not cloth, it is made of paper. Sometime I will explain what paper is. The lines on it are reading matter, and not written by hand, but printed. By and by I will explain what printing is. 1,000 of these sheets have been made, all exactly like this in every minute detail. They can't be told apart. Then they all broke out with exclamations of surprise and admiration. 1,000! Verily a mighty work, a year's work for many men. No, merely a day's work for a man and a boy. They crossed themselves and whiffed out a protective prayer or two. Ah, a miracle, a wonder, dark work of enchantment. I let it go at that. Then I read in a low voice, so as many as could crowd their shaven heads within hearing distance, part of the account of the miracle of the restoration of the well, and was accompanied by astonished and reverent exclamations all through. Ah, how true! Amazing, amazing! These be the very haps as they happened in marvelous exactness. And might they take this strange thing in their hands and feel of it and examine it? They would be very careful. Yes, so they took it, handling it as cautiously and devoutly as if it had been some holy thing come from some supernatural region, and gently felt of its texture, caressed its pleasant smooth surface with lingering touch, and scanned the mysterious characters with fascinated eyes. These grouped bent heads, these charmed faces, these speaking eyes, how beautiful to me. For was not this my darling, and was not all this mute wonder and interest and homage a most eloquent tribute and unforced compliment to it? I knew then how a mother feels when women, whether strangers or friends, take her new baby and close themselves about it with one eager impulse and bend their heads over it in a tranced adoration that makes all the rest of the universe vanish out of their consciousness and be as if it were not for that time. I knew how she feels, and that there is no other satisfied ambition, whether of king, conqueror, or poet, that ever reaches halfway to that serene far summit or yields half so divine a contentment. During all the rest of the seance, my paper traveled from group to group, all up and down and about that huge hall, and my happy eye was upon it always, and I sat motionless, steeped in satisfaction, drunk with enjoyment. Yes, this was heaven. I was tasting it once, if I might never taste it more. Chapter 27. The Yankee and the King Travel Incognito. About bedtime, I took the king to my private quarters to cut his hair and help him get the hang of the lowly raiment he was to wear. The high classes wore their hair banged across the forehead, but hanging to the shoulders the rest of the way around, whereas the lower ranks of commoners were banged fore and aft both. The slaves were bangless and allowed their hair free growth. So I inverted a bowl over his head and cut away all the locks that hung below it. I also trimmed his whiskers and mustache until they were only about a half-inch long, and tried to do it inartistically, and succeeded. It was a villainous disfigurement. When he got his lubberly sandals on and his long robe of coarse brown linen cloth, which hung straight from his neck to his ankle bones, he was no longer the comeliest man in the kingdom, but one of the unhandsomest and most commonplace and unattractive. We were dressed and barbered alike, and could pass for small farmers or farm bailiffs or shepherds or carters, yes, or for village artisans if we chose, our costume being in effect universal among the poor because of its strength and cheapness. I don't mean that it was really cheap to a very poor person, but I do mean that it was the cheapest material there was for male attire, manufactured material, you understand. We slipped away an hour before dawn, and by broad sunup had made 8 or 10 miles and were in the midst of a sparsely settled country. I had a pretty heavy knapsack. It was laden with provisions for the king to taper down on till he could take to the coarse fare of the country without damage. I found a comfortable seat for the king by the roadside, and then gave him a morsel or two to stay his stomach with. Then I said I would find some water for him and strolled away. Part of my project was to get out of sight and sit down and rest a little myself. It had always been my custom to stand when in his presence, even at the council board, except upon those rare occasions when the sitting was a very long one, extending over hours. Then I had a trifling little backless thing, which was like a reversed culvert, and was as comfortable as a toothache. I didn't want to break him in suddenly, but do it by degrees. We should have to sit together now when in company, or people would notice, but it would not be good politics for me to be playing equality with him when there was no necessity for it. I found the water some 300 yards away and had been resting about 20 minutes when I heard voices. That is all right, I thought. Peasants going to work. Nobody else likely to be stirring this early. But the next moment these comers jingled into sight around a turn of the road. Smartly clad people of quality with luggage mules and servants in their train. I was off like a shot through the bushes by the shortest cut. For a while it did seem that these people would pass the king before I could get to him. But desperation gives you wings, you know, and I canted my body forward, inflated my breast, and held my breath and flew. I arrived, and in plenty good enough time, too. Pardon, my king, but it's no time for ceremony. Jump! Jump to your feet. Some quality are coming. Is that a marvel? Let them come. But, my liege, you must not be seen sitting. Rise and stand in humble posture while they pass. You are a peasant, you know. True, I had forgot it, so lost was I in planning of a huge war with Gaul. He was up by this time, but a farm could have got up quicker, if there was any kind of a boom in real estate, and right so a thought came randoming overthwart this majestic dream, the which— A humbler attitude, my lord the king, and quick, duck your head, more, still more, droop it. He did his honest best, but Lord, it was no great things. He looked as humble as the Leaning Tower at Pisa. It is the most you could say of it. Indeed, it was such a thundering poor success that it raised wondering scowls all along the line, and a gorgeous flunky at the tail end of it raised his whip. But I jumped in time and was under it when it fell, and under cover of the volley of coarse laughter which followed, I spoke up sharply and warned the king to take no notice. He mastered himself for the moment, but it was a sore tax. He wanted to eat up the procession. I said, it would end our adventures at the very start, and we, being without weapons, could do nothing with that armed gang. If we are going to succeed in our enterprise, we must not only look the peasant, but act the peasant. It is wisdom, none can gainsay it. Let us go on, Sir Boss. I will take note and learn and do the best I may. He kept his word. He did the best he could, but I've seen better. If you have ever seen an active, heedless, enterprising child going diligently out of one mischief and into another all day long, and an anxious mother at its heels all the while, and just saving it by a hair from drowning itself or breaking its neck with each new experiment, you've seen the king in me. If I could have foreseen what the thing was going to be like, I should have said, no, if anybody wants to make his living exhibiting a king as a peasant, let him take the layout. I can do better with a menagerie and last longer. And yet during the first 3 days, I never allowed him to enter a hut or other dwelling. If he could pass muster anywhere during his early novitiate, it would be in small inns and on the road. So to these places we confined ourselves. Yes, he certainly did the best he could, but what of that? He didn't improve a bit that I could see. He was always frightening me, always breaking out with fresh astonishers in new and unexpected places. Toward evening on the second day, what does he do but blandly fetch out a dirk from inside his robe? Great guns, my liege, where did you get that? From a smuggler at the inn yestereve. What in the world possessed you to buy it? We have escaped divers dangers by thy wit, but I have bethought me that it were but prudence if I bore a weapon too. Thine might fail thee in some pinch. But people of our condition are not allowed to carry arms. What would a lord say, yes, or any other person of whatever condition, if he caught an upstart peasant with a dagger on his person? It was a lucky thing for us that nobody came along just then. I persuaded him to throw the dirk away, and it was as easy as persuading a child to give up some bright, fresh, new way of killing itself. We walked along, silent and thinking. Finally, the king said, when you know that I meditate a thing inconvenient, or that hath a peril in it, why do you not warn me to cease from that project? It was a startling question and a puzzler. I didn't quite know how to take hold of it or what to say, and so, of course, I ended by saying the natural thing. But, sire, how can I know what your thoughts are? The king stopped dead in his tracks and stared at me. I believed thou wert greater than Merlin, and truly in magic thou art. But prophecy is greater than magic. Merlin is a prophet. I saw I had made a blunder. I must get back my lost ground. After a deep reflection and careful planning, I said, Sire, I have been misunderstood. I will explain. There are two kinds of prophecy. One is the gift to foretell things that are but a little way off. The other is the gift to foretell things that are whole ages and centuries away. Which is the mightier gift, do you think? Oh, the last, most surely. True. Does Merlin possess it? Partly, yes. He foretold mysteries about my birth and future kingship that were 20 years away. Has he ever gone beyond that? He would not claim more, I think. It is probably his limit. All prophets have their limit. The limit of some of the great prophets has been 100 years. These are few, I ween. There have been two still greater ones whose limit was 400 and 600 years, and one whose limit compassed even 720. Gramercy, it is marvelous. But what are these in comparison with me? They are nothing. What? Canst thou truly look beyond even so vast a stretch of time as 700 years? My liege, as clear as the vision of an eagle does my prophetic eye penetrate and lay bare the future of this world for nearly 13 centuries and a half. My land, you should have seen the king's eyes spread slowly open and lift the earth's entire atmosphere as much as an inch. That settled Brer Merlin. One never had any occasion to prove his facts with these people. All he had to do was to state them. It never occurred to anybody to doubt the statement. Now then, I continued, I could work both kinds of prophecy, the long and the short, if I chose to take the trouble to keep in practice. But I seldom exercise any but the long kind, because the other is beneath my dignity. It is proper to Merlin's sort, stump-tail prophets, as we call them in the profession. Of course, I whet up now and then and flirt out a minor prophecy, but not often, hardly ever, in fact. You will remember that there was great talk when you reached the Valley of Holiness about my having prophesied your coming in the very hour of your arrival 2 or 3 days beforehand. Indeed, yes, I mind it now. Well, I could have done it as much as 40 times easier and piled on 1,000 times more detail into the bargain if it had been 500 years away instead of 2 or 3 days. How amazing that it should be so. Yes, a genuine expert can always foretell a thing that is 500 years away easier than he can a thing that's only 500 seconds off. And yet in reason it should clearly be the other way. It should be 500 times as easy to foretell the last as the first, for indeed it is so close by that one inspired that might almost see it. In truth, the law of prophecy doth contradict the likelihoods, most strangely making the difficult easy and the easy difficult. It was a wise head. A peasant's cap was no safe disguise for it. You could know it for a king's under a diving bell if you could hear it work its intellect. I had a new trade now and plenty of business in it. The king was as hungry to find out everything that was going to happen during the next 13 centuries as if he were expecting to live in them. From that time out, I prophesied myself bald-headed, trying to supply the demand. I have done some indiscreet things in my day, but this thing of playing myself for a prophet was the worst. Still, it had its ameliorations. A prophet doesn't have to have any brains. They are good to have, of course, for the ordinary exigencies of life, but they are no use in professional work. It is the restfulest vocation there is. When the spirit of prophecy comes upon you, you merely take your intellect and lay it off in a cool place for a rest, and unship your jaw and leave it alone. It will work itself, and the result is prophecy. Every day, a knight errant or so came along, and the sight of them fired the king's martial spirit every time. He would have forgotten himself, sure, and said something to them in a style a suspicious shade or so above his ostensible degree, and so I always got him well out of the road in time. Then he would stand and look with all his eyes, and a proud light would flash from them, and his nostrils would inflate like a war horse's, and I knew he was longing for a brush with them. But about noon of the third day I had stopped in the road to take a precaution which had been suggested by the whip stroke that had fallen to my share 2 days before, a precaution which I had afterward decided to leave untaken. I was so loath to institute it, but now I had just had a fresh reminder. While striding heedlessly along with jaw spread and intellect at rest, for I was prophesying, I stubbed my toe and fell sprawling. I was so pale I couldn't think for a moment. Then I got softly and carefully up and unstrapped my knapsack. I had that dynamite bomb in it, done up in wool in a box. It was a good thing to have along. The time would come when I could do a valuable miracle with it, maybe, but it was a nervous thing to have about me, and I didn't like to ask the king to carry it. Yet I must either throw it away or think up some safe way to get along with this society. I got out and slipped it into my scrip, and just then here came a couple of knights. The king stood, stately as a statue, gazing toward them, had forgotten himself again, of course, and before I could get a word of warning out, it was time for him to skip, and well that he did it, too. He supposed they would turn aside to avoid trampling peasant dirt underfoot. When had he ever turned aside himself, or ever had the chance to do it, if a peasant saw him or any other noble knight in time to judiciously save himself the trouble? The knights paid no attention to the king at all. It was his place to look out himself, and if he hadn't skipped, he would have been placidly ridden down and laughed at besides. The king was in a flaming fury and launched out his challenge and epithets with a most royal vigor. The knights were some little distance by now. They halted, greatly surprised, and turned in their saddles, and looked back as if wondering if it might be worthwhile to bother with such scum as we. Then they wheeled and started for us. Not a moment must be lost. I started for them. I passed them at a rattling gait, and as I went by, I flung out a hair-lifting, soul-scorching, 13-jointed insult which made the king's effort poor and cheap by comparison. I got it out of the 19th century, where they know how. They had such headway that they were nearly to the king before they could check up. Then, frantic with rage, they stood up their horses on their hind hoofs and whirled them around, and the next moment here they came breast to breast. I was 70 yards off then and scrambling up a great boulder at the roadside. When they were within 30 yards of me, they let their long lances droop to a level, depressed their mailed heads, and so, with their horsehair plumes streaming straight out behind, most gallant to see, this lightning express came tearing for me. When they were within 15 yards, I sent that bomb with a sure aim, and it struck the ground under the horses' noses. Yes, it was a neat thing, very neat and pretty to see. It resembled a steamboat explosion on the Mississippi. And during the next 15 minutes, we stood under a steady drizzle of microscopic fragments of knights and hardware and horseflesh. I say we, for the king joined the audience, of course, as soon as he had got his breath again. There was a hole there which would afford steady work for all the people in that region for some years to come, in trying to explain it, I mean. As for filling it up, that service would be comparatively prompt and would fall to the lot of a select few, peasants of that seigneury, and they wouldn't get anything for it either. But I explained it to the king myself. I said it was done with a dynamite bomb. This information did him no damage, because it left him as intelligent as he was before. However, it was a noble miracle in his eyes, and was another settler for Merlin. I thought it well enough to explain that this was a miracle of so rare a sort that it couldn't be done except when the atmospheric conditions were just right. Otherwise, he would be encoring it every time we had a good subject, and that would be inconvenient because I hadn't any more bombs along. We'll stop there and start next time with chapter 28. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.